The state government has said they'll examine if consent and reporting of sexual assault is being adequately taught in Queensland schools as part of a review. Now, my next guest says things are so drenched in porn in our culture now that consent education can't compete with the porn mega industry. And she says, I fear we may start thinking of consent as a magic bullet to get us out of this mess. Melinda Tankard-Reist has written a piece for the ABC on why consent doesn't stand a chance against porn culture. Melinda Tankard-Reist, first of all, teaching boys in particular about consent is important according to the research and the person we've just heard, but why don't you think it will be enough?
Well, I need to say up front, Steve, that I actually teach on consent and respectful relationships as well, so I do support those programs. However, my experience over a decade plus now of speaking in schools around the country has shown me that we need a multi-pronged approach. We need a specific focus on porn and porn culture, which is effectively the largest department of education in the world, training boys to consider women and girls as existing for their sexual use, training them in domination and aggression and callous behaviour. And unless we address that, then any other program we run just cannot compete.
What are you hearing in schools? So for 10 years now, I think you as Director of Collective Shout have been going to schools of Australia, talking to students, girls in particular, I think, but what are you hearing in those schools?
Steve, the stories are getting worse and they're getting worse younger. I never imagined when I first started speaking on these issues that I would be asked if I can design a program for grades 3 and 4. It's an absolute tragedy. We are conducting a never-before-seen experiment on the healthy sexual development of our young people. The stories I hear include sexual harassment of girls, including in the school grounds on a daily basis, sexual harassment on buses, demands for naked selfies, being groped, having your body judged in comparison to the bodies of porn stars. Just last week, a woman posted on my public Facebook saying that the daughter of a friend of hers who was in kindergarten had been told by a boy that if she didn't give him what he wanted, he would torture her. Now, this is not natural childish behaviour or natural curiosity. This is something else again. And too many of these young men think that they are entitled to this, and porn is teaching them that. And the research shows that. The studies are in that porn socialises boys to accept rape myths, for example, that no actually means yes. It trains them in aggressive behaviour. And the point I made in that article was that a lot of these boys have already done the consent education. If you read, as I have done, hundreds of the testimonials provided to Chanel Contos in her very significant culture reckoning petition, you'll see that these boys, too many of them, not all of them, but too many, are not interested in consent. They're interested in the taking. That's where the victory is. And you can't say to boys, don't treat girls like meat, when they're hooked up to this giant education department that is teaching them the very opposite.
Melinda Tankard-Reist is my guest. She's Director of Collective Shout. She's written a piece for the ABC on why consent doesn't stand a chance against porn culture. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. So I understand there's now a decade worth of studies about the effect of porn on boys in particular. What does it show? What else does it show? Because I think you argue that boys actually need to be de-radicalised, I think is the term you use.
Yes, it's actually the term of a colleague of mine in the UK, James Evans, who was a compulsive porn user. And he describes very profoundly where that use took him to the point where he was considering acts that would be criminal, and he turned back, and now he speaks about it. And he says that the internet radicalised him to change his attitudes towards women. It radicalized him to see them only in sexual ways, what he could get from them. He said he started to mentally undress women in his mind, and it cultivated in him attitudes that he didn't have before, and got him to a point where sexual gratification trumped empathy. He said, I had to learn to see women as human. He had to change his entire makeup that had been built through compulsive porn use. So it's a great term, de-radicalisation. The studies are solid. They are summarised very helpfully for us in a recent report by Our Watch, the Peak Body Addressing Violence Against Women in Australia. I linked to those in my piece. But fueling ideas of entitlement, of aggression, of misogyny, the rape myths, normalising aggressive and abusive behaviours, normalising sexual harassment. And the research shows that boys are being exposed to extreme content. We're talking torture porn, rape porn, sadism, incest-themed, child sexual abuse-themed pornography. And if boys are learning to be aroused by that kind of content, why would we be surprised by what we are witnessing now, what girls themselves are describing? 5,000 plus accounts now in that one poll. And this just echoes what I'm hearing everywhere I go around the country.
12 to 4, News at 4. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. The state government has announced they'll examine if consent and reporting of sexual assault is being adequately taught in Queensland schools as part of a review. My guest is the Director of Collective Shout, Melinda Tankard-Reist. She, for over a decade now, has been going to different schools in Australia, including here in Queensland. Melinda Tankard-Reist argues that consent training just doesn't stand a chance against porn culture. So what can educators do, Melinda Tankard-Reist? They're trying to get the message across to students as a formal part of the education curriculum.
Yes.
No means no. That you don't sexually harass someone, that you don't demand pictures of them and send it around. I mean, we have laws against that in Queensland now. If you basically take a photo of someone or they pass on an intimate photo on their mobile phone to you, you are breaking the law if you pass it on to a third party and ask for it from a minor. You're breaking the law.
Look, I think most schools that I engage with are doing the best they can, but they are up against it. Teachers are dealing with things that even their predecessors 5 years ago didn't have to deal with. This is something we've never seen before, and that is the indoctrination, that essentially the propagandizing of young people, the harm to their developing sexual templates at a critical stage in their lives.
This is when the young brain, sort of their neurons are developing, their brain patterns are being put down at a young age, where the brain is very, very malleable. Yes. Yes,
exactly. That critical formative time in a young person's development. And we have allowed this experiment to happen. So while schools need to do everything they can, including institute the kind of programs we're talking about, including addressing illegal or potentially illegal behaviours in school, including setting a good example and being good role models to our young people, especially male teachers. While all those things have to happen, this takes a whole of community effort. It is too big for schools alone. What are our governments doing? What are our so-called regulatory bodies doing? I believe that these institutions that are supposed to be protecting the most vulnerable have offloaded their ethical duties to citizens like myself and my colleagues to speak out and to fight this. It's too hard. 1 year ago, last week, a federal government committee reported on an inquiry into an age verification scheme to at least put some obstacle in the way of children accessing the kind of porn I've been talking about. 1 year ago, that committee reported and recommended looking into implementing that scheme, given the weight of evidence on the harms to children. And the government has yet to respond. And I find that surprising. Yes, I know we've had COVID and everything else, but it's still pretty unusual that it would be a year without the government response and I've been trying to find out why that's taking so long. At least give that a go. At least give that a try, because right now there are no protections. There's no proof of age protection or requirements at all. And as long as we do nothing, we will see more children mentally, physically, psychologically damaged. And that's what we're being told. The Australian Children's Foundation, for example, says that they are receiving more reports of children being damaged. We're talking serious psychological harm, especially. Don't we want to do something about that? Can't we find some common ground here and say we at least need to protect the most vulnerable among us? Otherwise, we will see growing accounts towards the Chanel Contos division. Those stories will not stop unless we address this as a matter of urgency.
Feminist academic Caroline Norma has said that basically we've got an entire generation exposed to this material really in the absence of any government or industry regulation. Is she right? Do you agree?
Well, of course I agree with Caroline because we co-wrote a book together.
Right, okay.
I think it was Michael Salter that said that, if you're quoting from the ABC piece, but Caroline would be 100% on board with that as well. That is that we've got this huge gap in terms of government regulatory response. It is too hard. Schools are crying out for help. Parents are crying out for help. Those working with children at the coalface, the child development experts, say this is just too much. We need something to happen at the highest level now if we are going to have any hope of stopping this warping and deforming of our young people.
I know parents give it a go. I mean, the advice to parents is don't let computers, pad devices be in the bedroom, let them be in the lounge room where all the family can see what's being viewed, but it's pretty hard for families to sort of monitor 24/7.
It's absolutely impossible. A lot of the reports that I hear from parents are that their child was exposed at the school camp, in the school ground, during recess and lunchtime, on the school bus on the way home, at the friend's house where there may not be the same controls on devices. It is just a click away. And while parents have to step up to the plate, of course, a lot of blame is being put on parents. Parents, I believe, are being made the scapegoats for lack of regulatory response to this very critical problem.
Just stay with me if you would, please, Melinda. Alyssa's got an interesting question I want to raise with you. Gareth of South Brisbane, what concerns you about this discussion around boys and consent, Gareth?
I think, and look, it seems to be going on the whole week and everything else. I'm really concerned that boys are going to feel marginalised against, because the whole discussion, and I'm completely aware that it is backed up by academic evidence. I'm not discounting that.
Sure.
But we need to be very, very careful that we're not marginalising all boys. As people know, teenagers do take a lot of things to heart.
Yes.
My honest opinion is that we need to initiate parental training to help parents understand how to teach their kids, not to actually take advantage of ladies, not to disrespect ladies. It starts in the home. My son, he's 8 years old. He knows exactly that people are people. He knows that you don't respect the women at school. He knows that you help the people at school if they're struggling. It's because we teach it in the home.
Yes.
You're never, ever going to get rid of porn. You're never going to get rid of the motivation behind that particular thing, especially with teenagers because they're growing. You really need to help them understand what they're doing wrong. That comes in the home. And the other important thing as well is there's also a study that I read probably a few months ago to say that young girls are just as partial to investigating the whole issues around porn as well. It's not only the boys.
All right, let me leave it there. Mulcher, Gareth was concerned that boys are going to be sort of marginalised and blamed, and that we need to be concerned about that. Melinda Tankard-Rees, do you have sort of any thoughts on that?
Yeah, funnily enough, I do. I actually work with boys as well. A lot of my work is with young men, and they are being damaged by these toxic cultural messages as well. A lot of those boys that Chanel Contos has documented through the accounts of girls would have had that education. They would have been told these things, but they're still acting out, and that's why we have to address porn. That's why I said we can't just leave it to parents. It is too hard. The second thing I want to say, whatever study he's referring to, I'm not aware of it, the stats are not the same at all. That's not to say young women aren't looking, but the pathways are different. Often it's a guy wanting her to look with him and wanting to enact on her what he has seen. So the pathways to use are quite different, and the statistics are not the same. Regardless of that, it's damaging to all sexes. Certainly, I would not deny that. And I'm not about marginalising boys. I work with them. I have young men on my team. I have a young man travelling around the country with me, jointly presenting with me, and we will be doing that in Queensland in May, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Let me ask you this one thing. So both you, Caroline, Norma and others have expressed concern that the porn industry is basically unregulated in any way. And you heard Gareth say something I've heard for many years. You'll never stop it, quote unquote.
Well, we said that about other crimes against humanity in the past as well, didn't we? And while that's, possibly true, I can't live according to that viewpoint. I have to do what I can right now to address a serious public health crisis for the sake of our young people. And if only a few young people decide to resist the toxic scripts of pornography for their lives, to me that's a good thing, and I'll keep working one by one, as well as lobbying at the federal and state level to change something that is toxic and harmful and, genuinely hurting vast numbers of young people.
Appreciate you coming on. Thanks very much for your time.
Steve, always a pleasure. Thanks for your interest.
Melinda Tankard-Reist is Director of Collective Shout. She's written a piece for the ABC on why consent doesn't stand a chance against porn culture.
Wednesdays on ABC TV.